Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Do you want AI involved in your brain surgery?
If it's really good.
Okay, the reason I'm asking
well.
is because China is actually testing an AI assistant for neurosurgeons at 7 hospitals in Beijing. The bot's going to answer questions with citations based on more than 1 million academic records, could help with CT scans, images. Eventually, though, the researchers envision the AI taking a more active role, warning doctors from pursuing risky procedures, for instance.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about this, right? We have a great guest to talk about this because, you know, the idea of having AI helping in the operating room could be an issue of trust. But you do wonder, you could have a doctor who's had a little tired watching the Oscars or doing something else. And you do wonder about that element. So there's a lot at stake here. And we've got a great guest to get into it.
Yeah, Michelle Giuda is CEO of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Perdue. She's also former Assistant Secretary of State for Global Public Affairs. That was during the Trump administration from 2018 to 2020. Michelle joins us from Austin, Texas. Michelle, good to have you on with us. How are you?
Good to be with you.
Well, good to join. I'm so glad you're joining us on this because we've been talking a lot about AI, as you can probably imagine. But you and the team over at the Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Perdue, I got a poll on our radar from Edelman, and we talked to the Edelman team a lot about their trust barometer. And this one specifically has to do with trust in AI companies declining. It's not just here in the US, but it's around the world too. How can companies that are working on this technology earn the trust of us?
So thanks for that question. I've seen that poll, and it says that about 35% of Americans now trust companies to do what's right when it comes to artificial intelligence. But let me give 2 other numbers for you. The first is 2030, which is the year that China has stated that it wants to lead and dominate in artificial intelligence. The other number is $51 billion. And that's how much China is committing to science and technology, which is up 10% from last year. They just announced this coming out of their National Party Congress. And I share those because there's important context in terms of the trust that we are putting in our government and in our tech companies to innovate properly when it comes to artificial intelligence. But it's not happening in a vacuum. That is happening in the context of a competition with adversaries across the world who want to use these technologies, dominate in these technologies, and compete with us in order to advance their value system and their systems of government, which are authoritarian versus ours. So that's really important context. But this notion of trust is so central. And it's not about the tech, it's about the trust. And the good news is we don't just have to rely on government to get it right. We don't just have to rely on tech companies to get it right. And what the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Perdue is doing is also making sure that citizens are involved in shaping this, that they have a right and they have a responsibility in order to help shape and dictate where AI goes. I'm here at South by Southwest in Austin. This is a gathering every year of creatives and leaders in media and in innovation. And that's why we're here having conversations around, well, what is the necessary role that you play in national security and in geopolitical competition? So it's getting everybody involved.
I'm curious.
And here's 2 practical ways to do that.
Well, hold on. I just want to jump in real quick because if there is one thing that unites Democrats and Republicans, there's only one thing, I think. It's kind of beating up on these tech CEOs when they do testify. And we did see in recent weeks examples of the way that Democrats and Republicans do not think that companies like Meta Platforms have guardrails on the way that they're serving content, the algorithms that they're using to feed content to, for lack of a better term, minors here in the US. So I'm wondering how you can rely solely on companies to actually get this right without involvement from government or without relying on government.
Yeah. Well, I would add and maybe challenge what you just said. There's actually another really bipartisan issue in DC, and that is winning the competition against China, and specifically on technology. And so with that context, it isn't just about relying on tech companies to get it right, whether it's in the US or in any of our like-minded partners and allies countries. And it isn't just relying on government. One good example, talking about bipartisanship, is there's a new House bipartisan task force on artificial intelligence. So you've got leaders in the House across both sides of the aisle coming together to think about how do we engage industry in the right way, engage the public in the right way in dictating what role artificial intelligence plays in our lives. That's a great place for those who responded to the poll and said they don't trust companies and they don't trust government to get it right. then working with and getting involved with the members, there's 12 members in that House caucus and that task force, is a really good way to do it.
How do we do that? I mean, companies are going to be very careful. They don't love regulatory oversight. They don't like what they might deem as extreme regulatory oversight. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate. So how do we create quickly the right private-public partnership on this? And to be fair, it's got to be global. None of these companies are operating in a vacuum, right? We've seen this with financial regulatory oversight, and often Europe has led. We think about kind of climate, Europe has led. So how do we do this in a smart way and quickly?
It's interesting. You actually see companies, Microsoft, for example, trying to lead the conversation on AI and essentially saying, we're not going to wait for government regulations to figure this out, and we're actually going to put out a proactive point of view on what we think some of the guardrails might be and initiate that conversation with government, not only here in the US, but to your point, in Europe and across other parts of the world. And that was a lesson learned, I think, from social media, where we're flipping the script now and seeing private sector companies try to initiate that conversation. And that's a good thing because, look,
Do you feel like, can I ask you something though, Michelle? Do you feel like the world has learned their message on not having enough oversight on social media? And I know we get into a free speech, it's complicated, right? It's not so black and white. But have we learned the lesson that, not having enough oversight in social media and content and, the false content that gets out there, the content that can hurt in so many different ways, have we really learned the lesson so that we get it right this time around when it comes to AI?
I definitely think you see some changes. So, for example, when Facebook came out, Twitter came out, there wasn't a House bipartisan caucus on social media because we didn't know that we needed one. And that all came after the fact. So now in the early days, you have things like this task force in the House trying to get ahead of it. You have companies, I mentioned Microsoft earlier, trying to get ahead of it. But here's the thing. We don't want to rely too much on and point the finger at government to say, go figure it out. Because if tech companies and innovators don't know where the technology is going, our government leaders sure as heck don't know where it's going. And so this has to be a collaborative conversation, not only with the innovators and the high tech companies and with government leaders and policymakers, but also with customers of those tech companies and constituents of those politicians.
But how can we trust can we trust them to do it right? Come on, because they make money over, having more eyeballs, the velocity on social media platforms. How can we trust tech companies to do the right thing here?
Well, that's where I don't think it just has to be hey, we're going to trust you and I'm going to sit here and watch and be a spectator and I hope you get it right. Whether it's asking that of tech companies or it's asking that of governments, it's, well, then what is the role of a customer? What is the role of an end user? And what is the role of a citizen in getting involved now on the front end in driving that conversation?
Hey, Michelle, we only have 30 seconds left. Should the U.S. force TikTok's parent company to divest TikTok?
Well, the U.S. is giving them the option to divest or be banned. But yes, because ByteDance is a Chinese company. They're required by law to provide information to the Chinese Communist Party, and it's a surveillance platform and it's an influence operations platform. So it is a national security issue.
I feel like we scratched the surface. Will you come back soon? Tim's angry because I got like 3 questions in a row with you.
Never again.
We have a ton to talk about.
Come back. Michelle Giuda, she is CEO of Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy over at Perdue, joining us from Austin, Texas. I'm sorry. I got a little excited because how do we trust them?
I want to talk to her too.
How do we trust them?
I'll call her after.
To do the right thing. All right, now he's not even going to listen to me. All right, you're listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek.
Well, another piece of the Biden administration's sweeping policy response to climate change fell into place last week. That was when the SEC voted to approve highly anticipated climate disclosure requirements for public companies.
That's right, Tim. The SEC's new rule is groundbreaking in that it requires public companies to make certain climate disclosures, mainly reporting of greenhouse gas emissions for the first time. Large public companies will be required to disclose their direct or Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Notably, they must do so only if they deem them material significant to their bottom line. That's what that means.
Okay, so all that said, some environmental advocates say it doesn't go far enough. Leslie Labruto is Managing Director of Sustainable Finance at the Environmental Defense Fund. It's a nonprofit that works to address climate change, which it calls the greatest challenge of our time. She joins us from London today. Leslie, do you think the SEC climate disclosure requirement goes far enough?
Hey guys, great to be here. To be honest, this SEC ruling, it's a positive development for businesses and investors. We needed this step. It was overdue, and finally, it's a chance to bring the United States to a point of consistency and rigor in disclosures that we hadn't seen before. So we obviously, the commission will go further, but this is a foundational step that we need to take in order to start moving us forward.
How much further? Do you want the SEC to mandate that companies disclose emissions within their supply chain? Because that's what a lot of critics are pushing back on right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, we need to start somewhere. And at this point, when we see all of the considerations being taken into account, climate risk is financial risk, and this is where we need to start. And, you know, the SEC has long required disclosures across a number of different metrics. And finally, we're seeing a step forward in really getting public companies to where they need to be. And with the timeline of disclosures, it also gets smaller companies, gives them a chance to really get up to speed. And then finally, we can evolve on this rule over time. But for now, this is where we need to start to get the ball moving.
I mean, this is what ESG was supposed to be, I think, about, right? To really understand environmental, social governance issues and what risks financially, materially, they are for companies. Having said that, what the SEC is doing and Chair Gensler is doing, we're now getting a standardization, right? So apples to apples from company to company.
But it's more than that. It's apples to apples, but finally, we have an ability to foster transparency. It means that investors and people like you and me can finally start seeing the data, as you said, apples to apples, but it also builds a more resilient market, right? If you're in Louisiana and you're a company and you're not thinking about flooding, you're not thinking about the material risks to your business that are going to affect ultimately your resilience and your growth. And, you know, imagine if you're a utility company and you're not thinking about wildfires. I mean, if you look at the data, the US alone has suffered $600 billion in damages from just about 100 weather events in the last 5 years alone. These are things that we're trying to start taking into consideration when we're looking at businesses and evaluating, you know, should I invest in this one or that one? We now have data around just climate risk, which again is a financial risk that can help us make better decisions, help investors figure out where to allocate capital, and again, help folks from Main Street to Wall Street figure out where to put their money.
Leslie, we talked Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but my understanding is the biggest change from the proposed rules initially that public companies are no longer required to report Scope 3 emissions are those from the supply chain and the downstream use of products, even though that these often represent the largest portion of a company's greenhouse gas emissions. So is that kind of a big bummer, to be quite honest?
I mean, look, again, we got to start somewhere, right?
Okay.
And when we look at where we got to start in the United States, we're asking public companies to now do something that, mind you, 99% of the S&P 500 already report on some metrics around sustainability and non-financial metrics in general. So for us, it's a chance to really bring us up to speed. And then we hope the SEC can keep evolving on this decision over time, right? This isn't a one and done deal. We have time to keep evolving this and, you know, bring the United States to, you know, where it wants to be in terms of fully encompassing climate risk as financial
When do we
risk.
see this move the needle for investors? Like, when do we start to see this type of data come out and actually move a company's stock price?
You know, a lot of this data already exists. We talked to one investor. They have to collect 25,000 data points right now just to get a view of climate risk. And it's oftentimes really inconsistent. Because this ruling is taking effect and we can start, you know, taking time, in about a year, those 25,000 data points that might be inaccurate, we can start seeing them streamlined and be reliable. So again, investors can start looking apples to apples, and we can start seeing not only what are the risks, but how are these companies mitigating them as early as next year.
Right. And to be fair, I mean, Leslie, this is about how climate can impact financially, or does it have a material financial impact on a company? That's what this is about. This isn't necessarily assuming that it's going to force companies to do something better for the climate. Is that fair?
This is all about managing risk. It is asking companies to say, what material risks have you identified and what are you going to do about it? So when we're reading reports, analyst reports, looking at a company, we can say, oh, they've considered these things that are straight up risks to the company. And we know that they're mitigating them. Again, I mentioned the stat about $600 billion in damages from weather events.
Right.
This is real stuff. These are real risks that we're talking about. And this gives us a chance to look at those and say, did this company consider them? Are they looking at the things that pose significant risks to their business that could affect me and you and investors in making decisions about allocating capital, where to put more money, and how to shift kind of, what we're seeing as the future for a resilient market in the United States.
Well, having said that, I don't know what work you guys have done over at the EDF, but I do wonder in terms of, the insurance industry. Tim and I and our Bloomberg News team, they have done a lot of reporting about, was it home insurance in California or Florida, where insurers are just kind of backing off because of the costs. Have you guys done works where you feel like certain industries, whether it's insurance, whether it's home builders, I don't know what, where they are, once we get a clearer picture, we might find that there's a lot more of climate-related material effects on their businesses that maybe has been way underreported?
Yeah, our team, we are constantly trying to equip the financial community with independent analysis of what they need most to make decisions around climate risk. And this completely includes the insurance markets as well. I mean, you said it so well, right? We're seeing insurance shifts all over the place, people retracting from markets, premiums going up. And a lot of it has to do with, we have no idea how to price and assess the risk that climate poses on businesses. So when we look at the insurance market, for example, it's a great chance for us to say, how are insurers thinking about this? Where can alternative tools step in to build resiliency? And how do we stop kind of fueling the beast, so to speak, by making decisions that put consumers at risk, like building homes in flood zones, right? And if we have a chance to start assessing data that's apples to apples, we can start making better decisions that, again, are working for just the general public and you and me.
It's so interesting, Carol, I'm looking at shares of Vail Resorts. They're right now down 5%. This is a company that owns many mountains throughout the United States, some outside of the U.S. The company came out with earnings and said that they had unfavorable conditions, 42% lower snowfall across the entire Western North American resorts through January compared to the same period a year prior.
So this would play right into it.
Exactly. I mean, this is a company that has,
example.
Yeah, and that it's like, because of climate change, because of our shifting climate, they're seeing real detriment.
No, and so Leslie, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. You're nodding your head. Is California, though, the holy grail? Because when it comes to rules, in terms of, in regards, I guess, to some of the climate, if you will, or sustainability reporting requirements, is California kind of the holy grail in terms of where we need to go with this? I know you say it's important, it's great, it's a first step, but like, what's the end game in your view?
We've seen different regulations come through in different states, and this ruling is a chance to really streamline what we're seeing. Obviously, different states have adopted different kind of rigor in terms of, where they want to see on climate reporting. Finally, because the SEC is an independent body, we're seeing a streamlining of the data that's going to be coming through. So it's a real chance to take the U.S. to a place that is consistent, right? And we've already seen sort of some of these multinational disclosure frameworks in other markets, Canada, Australia, the EU, China. The US now has this as well to kind of bring us to a speed where it's international and global.
We only have 10 seconds left, but if the election, if President Trump wins the election in November, what happens to these rules or the way you think about things?
I mean, fortunately, again, the SEC is an independent agency acting on a mandate from Congress to protect investors at the end of the day and maintain
So you're not
efficiency. Hey, you don't know, but again, because they're an independent agency, we're feeling that these disclosures, hopefully, fingers crossed, are here to stay.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Hey, Leslie, thank you so much. Leslie Labruto, Managing Director of Sustainable Finance at the Environmental Defense Fund, joining us right here in New York City.